Final Fantasy games are almost always guaranteed to be loaded with excellent, memorable boss fights, whether that comes in the form of story bosses or optional encounters. Being one of the best games this series has to offer, it's not very surprising that Final Fantasy VII has more than a few great boss fights as well. In this feature, we'll be talking about some of our favorites. Emerald Weapon. When you think of gruelingly difficult optional boss fights in video games, chances are your mind jumps straight to Emerald Weapon. Literally a million hit points, sweeping attacks that can do devastating damage, and a time limit unless you have the underwater materia. It's a proper gauntlet. Funnily enough, it's for this reason that many find this battle to be among the most frustrating ones in the entire series. But there's just something about besting this foe, a rush of adrenaline that surges through you when you finally conquer this enemy that is hard to replicate. Ruby Weapon. Ruby Weapon is nearly as hard of a boss fight as Emerald Weapon is, if not more. Not only does this battle begin with your party at a disadvantage, which can immediately be a massive setback against an enemy that has an arsenal of attacks as deadly as this, there's plenty of other threats to contend with as well. Ruby Weapon has surprisingly high defense, making most attacks quite ineffective against it, and the only way to do any significant amount of damage is to attack its tentacles, which it does not expose until only one of your party members is alive. If there was ever a boss that did justice to the phrase super boss, this would have to be it. Diamond Weapon. Unlike the Emerald and Ruby weapons, the Diamond Weapon was not a fight that could be skipped, which is great because it is an unforgettable encounter. It comes off the back of excellent narrative buildup and happens in context of truly high stakes, and the battle itself lives up to all of that. It's a very challenging fight, to say the very least, but it's one that sticks out in our memories to this day because of how frickin' epic it was. Ultimate Weapon. We had to complete the set, and it only makes sense because Ultimate Weapon belongs on this list just as much as the other weapons, but for very different reasons. It is essentially multiple boss fights in one, and fighting it across multiple locations, sometimes on land and sometimes in the air, and slowly chipping away at its health as you inch closer and closer to defeating it for good is a very unique way to structure a boss encounter. It's a better encounter on repeat playthroughs, when you have the benefit of knowing which locations you can head to continue your fight against it, but even on a first playthrough, it still feels unique. BIZARRO Sephiroth. Obviously, Sephiroth had to be in here. After having built him up as the ultimate bad guy, and having done so in spectacular fashion throughout the course of the entire game, Final Fantasy VII pits Cloud and company against him in a climactic fight, and it does justice to the hours and hours of buildup that led to it. With multiple parts of his twisted body demanding attention during the fight, and each of them having unique advantages that complement each other, this is a fight that strikes almost the perfect balance between being a satisfying narrative payoff and a mechanically interesting encounter. Safer Sephiroth. Of course, BIZARRO Sephiroth is only one phase of this final boss fight. Safer Sephiroth is really the actual final boss of Final Fantasy VII, and what a boss fight it is. Epic, challenging, and teeming with visual flair. This is a fight that knows how to close the chapter on an unforgettable journey in equally unforgettable fashion. MIDGAR ZOLOM. Given that this gigantic serpent is one of the most iconic enemies in all of Final Fantasy VII, it shouldn't be too surprising to see it figuring into this list. Though it starts off with a fairly simple but still pretty hard-hitting moveset, its attacks continue to become more and more vicious as it takes more damage, and the closer to defeat it gets, the deadlier its attacks become. Though this fight happens relatively early on in the game, it makes enough of an impact that we still remember it as one of the most thrilling boss fights. MATERIA Keeper. The perfect example of how to force a player to understand and fully utilize a game's main mechanics, because the Materia Keeper, appropriately enough, is a fight that needs you to pay attention to your materia. Not only does it have devastating attacks, it can also heal and pull itself from the brink of death, which means smartly equipping and using your materia becomes key. Can it also be a frustrating fight? Well, sure, especially when you consider that it is immediately preceded by Mount Nebel, one of the worst dungeons in the game. But when it clicks, it really clicks. Rufus. The fight against Rufus isn't particularly challenging, though it's not exactly a cakewalk either, and mechanically speaking doesn't throw too many hurdles your way, but the way it's set up is just too cool. It represents the end of the Midgar section of the game, and is appropriately bombastic and flashy. fighting one-on-one against the new president of Shinra, while a helicopter flies overhead, the scenes that precede and follow it. It's all the very definition of epic. Lost number. Final Fantasy VII was great at throwing boss fights at players that demanded them to always be on their feet. One such example was the Materia Keeper, which we already spoke of, and another fight that kept changing things up to make sure players were paying attention was Lost Number. With a physical and magical form that it would keep switching between, this fight required players to keep adjusting their tactics and not ever get too comfortable with any single strategy. Beating him also rewards players with a great summon and a pretty cool character being added to your party, which makes this fight that much sweeter. Demon's Gate. Demon's Gate is an enemy that comes up in Final Fantasy games time and time again as an enemy, and it almost never disappoints. Its appearance in Final Fantasy VII is probably one of its best. With an arsenal full of attacks that can damage all party members at once, a couple of attacks that are more isolated but extremely hard-hitting, and a couple of moves that can inflict status effects to really turn the tide of battle, when this fight takes place, it's probably the toughest one in the entire game up until that point. JENOVA-BIRTH. JENOVA-BIRTH is probably among the weaker fights in the group of encounters we've mentioned in this feature thus far, but it's more memorable because of non-gameplay related reasons than anything else. There's also the fact that this fight really comes out of nowhere and takes players by surprise, which means it instantly makes its mark almost by default. Carry Armor. What an absolute pain this fight could be if you went into it unprepared. Chances are, on your first try, you almost certainly got wrecked, many dead. Its Lapis laser attack is an absolute nightmare, but even worse is the ability to grab party members, and then not only render them completely immobile, but also suck away at their health until they die. Unless you properly utilize your entire fighting party in this battle, you're in for a bad time. Proud CLOD. You're fighting against a giant mech equipped with massive weapons and badass claws. It's hard to mess this up. Thankfully, the boss fight itself more than lives up to that cool premise. Contrary to what it looks like though, it's not exactly the flashiest of enemies. It's more defensive-minded than most boss fights we've spoken of here. But that means this becomes a battle of attrition, where patience and strategy are key. Eagle Gun. Speaking of giant mechanical weaponized enemies, the Eagle Gun might not be nearly as fearsome as most, if not all bosses in this feature, but there's plenty else that makes this fight stand out. For starters, there's the visual design of the boss itself, while some of its stronger physical attacks can also be surprisingly punishing. Thankfully, it doesn't have an awful amount of HP, so smartly selecting attacks can ensure that this fight goes fairly smoothly. And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from GamingBolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.